A billionaire's son watched his wife set down her bag, look directly at the woman sitting on their couch, and walk back out the front door without saying a single word. He thought she was upset. He thought she needed an hour. He thought she would come back. He had no idea she had just made the calmest and most calculated decision of her life. He had no idea who she actually was. And by the time he found out, the ground beneath everything he had built was already shifting. This is Amara's story, and it begins as most important stories do, not with a dramatic moment, but with a quiet one. Amara Osi woke up at 5:47 every morning, not because an alarm told her to, not because the day demanded it. She woke up at 5:47 because that was the hour her grandmother used to rise in the house in Accra, moving through the kitchen before dawn with the particular unhurried purpose of a woman who understood that the early hours belonged to people who intended to do something real with their lives. Amara had inherited that understanding the way she had inherited everything from her grandmother. Quietly, permanently, without ceremony, she would lie still for exactly 3 minutes after waking, which was a habit she had developed during the years she spent studying. A deliberate pause before the day began, a moment to gather herself before she gave her attention to everything else. Then she would rise, make coffee in the kitchen of the London penthouse that Daniel's name was on the lease of, stand at the floor-to-ceiling window that looked out over the city, still purple with early morning, and she would think, not about the marriage, though the marriage had been giving her things to think about for the better part of 8 months, not about Richard Caldwell, Daniel's father, who had made his opinion of her clear in 100 small, precise ways, across 3 years of family dinners and company events where he spoke around her and through her, and never once directly to her. She thought about her work. She thought about the manuscript she was reviewing for a historian at the University of Edinburgh, whose research on colonial land rights in West Africa intersected in 3 specific places with records her grandfather's company held. She thought about the paper she was quietly drafting in response, which she had not told anyone about, because Amara had learned early and well that the most powerful thing a person could do in a room full of people who had already decided what she was to simply keep working. She had a PhD in economic history from Oxford. She had completed it at 26, 2 years before she met Daniel, while simultaneously managing the London administrative office of the Osi Group on behalf of her grandfather, Emmanuel Osi, who had trusted her with that responsibility since she was 23, and who had never once asked her to make herself smaller, to make anyone else comfortable. No one in Daniel's world knew any of this. Daniel knew. Daniel had known from the beginning, which was part of why she had loved him. He had sat across from her at a conference dinner in London, and within 20 minutes of conversation, he had stopped looking at her, the way men at those events usually looked at her, and started looking at her, the way people look at someone who has just said something that reorganized their understanding of a problem they had been thinking about for years. He had asked her questions, real questions, the kind that required actual answers. She had told him about the Osi Group that evening, straightforwardly, because she did not play games with information about herself when someone was being genuine. She had told him about her grandfather, about the portfolio, about the work she was doing on the land rights research. He had listened with the full attention of someone who found the thing being said genuinely interesting. Not impressive, not useful, just interesting. She had decided that evening that he was worth knowing. 2 years later, she had decided he was worth marrying. The wedding had been small by design. Amara did not want a production. She wanted a real thing, witnessed by people who loved them, in a room that felt like a beginning rather than a performance. They married in a garden in the Cotswolds on a Saturday in September, with 40 people present, none of whom were Richard Caldwell. Richard had sent a card and a wire transfer for £250,000, which Amara had returned within 48 hours with a brief, polite note that said simply that she and Daniel appreciated the gesture and wished him well. Daniel had looked at her when she told him what she'd done. She had looked back. "He sent it to manage me," she said. "I don't need managing." Daniel had been quiet for a moment. Then he had said, "I know." And the way he said it, the particular weight of it, told her that he understood exactly what his father had meant by the gesture, and that he was glad she had responded the way she had. That was the version of Daniel she had married. The version that had been slowly disappearing for Hazard, or the harder to 8 months, was harder to describe, because it had not happened dramatically. There had been no single moment of change. It had been incremental, the way erosion works, gradual and quiet and most visible only in retrospect. Richard had come back into Daniel's daily life when the Caldwell Group's European expansion had hit regulatory complications that required Daniel's direct involvement. What that meant in practical terms was that Daniel began spending 3 days a week in his father's offices, then 4. Then he was traveling to Frankfurt and Amsterdam and Dubai with his father's team, and the calls home became shorter. And when he was home, he was present in the way a person is present, when part of their attention is somewhere else entirely. Amara had noticed. She noticed everything. She had simply waited because she believed in giving people room to navigate difficulty. And she had believed, for longer than she should have, that what she was watching was a man, under pressure, who needed patience, not a man making choices he hadn't yet admitted to himself. By the time she understood the difference, she had already been patient for 6 months too long. She knew something was wrong 3 months before that Tuesday evening, not because of anything she saw, but because of the quality of the silence between them. Amara had spent her life paying attention to silence. There was the silence of two people, comfortable enough to share a room without feeling. And there was the silence of two people who had stopped saying the things that mattered because saying them required a conversation neither of them was ready to have. The silence in the penthouse had changed its quality. She felt it every morning at the window, with her coffee, the city, below her, and Daniel still asleep in the room behind her. The space between them wider than the distance the floor plan suggested. She did not cry about it. She did not call her mother or her closest friend at WOA and unpack it over the phone. She held it the way she held most difficult things, close and still, and she waited for the moment of clarity that she trusted would come. It came on a Tuesday. She had left a board meeting 40 minutes early because the final agenda item had been resolved faster than expected, and she had a book she wanted to get back to. And the penthouse was only 12 minutes by car from the offices, where she kept a small consultancy workspace that her grandfather had insisted on funding, and that she had quietly accepted, because Emmanuel Ossi had never once been wrong about what she needed. She rode the elevator up to the 32nd floor. She put her key in the door. She pushed it open, and she saw the woman on her couch, sitting sideways on the cushions, dark hair loose, wearing what Amara recognized immediately as Daniel's weekend shirt. Holding a glass of the wine Amara had brought back from a trip to Bordeaux 2 months ago, looking up with the expression of someone who had been expecting this moment and had decided that the most powerful response was to appear completely unbothered. Daniel was on the other end of the couch. He stood when he saw her. His face went through several things very quickly. Amara looked at the woman. She looked at Daniel. She looked at the wine glass. She set her bag down on the entryway table, very gently, without a word, and she turned around and walked back out the door. Before we continue with this incredible journey, I want to say something to you directly. I spent a long time with this story, shaping every detail, every quiet moment, every turn, because I believe the best stories are the ones that make you feel something real. If this is already pulling at something in you, if you want to know what Amara does next and what Daniel is about to discover about the woman he underestimated, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. It means more than you know. Now let's continue. Before we go further, have you ever stayed quiet about something important because you were waiting for the right moment to act? Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Daniel Caldwell stood in the middle of his living room for 45 seconds after the door closed. He counted them without meaning to, the way the mind latches onto small, measurable things when everything else has become suddenly unmeasurable. 45 seconds of complete stillness. The door closed, the room quiet, the wine glass still sitting on the coffee table with Sophia's lipstick on the rim, the fire still going in the fireplace that Amara had chosen, because she said a home needed a hearth, something warm at its center. Then he moved. "You need to go," he said to Sophia. His voice came out flat in a way that surprised even him. Sophia Marchetti looked at him with the careful expression of a woman recalibrating. She had been composed when Amara walked in, composed in the specific way she was always composed, with the practiced ease of someone who had decided that confidence was the most effective strategy in any uncomfortable situation. But something in Daniel's voice now made the composure shift slightly at its edges. "Daniel, I need you to go right now." He was already moving toward the bedroom, picking up the jacket she had left on the chair, her bag from the side table. He brought them to her, without drama, without anger, just with the focused efficiency of a man who has understood in the past 45 seconds, that he has made a catastrophic mistake, and that every additional second spent on anything other than correcting it is a second he cannot afford. Sophia stood. She took her things. She looked at him for a moment, with something in her face that was more complicated than the situation deserved. She won't forgive this, Sophia said quietly. I know, Daniel said, and he opened the front door and waited. After she left, Daniel stood alone in the penthouse and felt the specific quality of the silence that Amara had left behind. It was different from the silence of an empty room. It had weight to it. It had shape. It was the silence of a person who had said everything they needed to say without using a single word. And he understood it completely, which made it worse. He called her number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He texted, Amara, please, tell me where you are. He stood at the window where she stood every morning with her coffee and looked at the city below. And he thought about the expression on her face when she had walked through that door. He had expected tears. He had expected anger. He had known in the part of himself he had been refusing to examine honestly for months that this moment was coming. And he had constructed in his mind a version of it that involved raised voices and doors slamming and the kind of confrontation that was painful but survivable. What he had not expected was what actually happened. She had looked at the woman on her couch. She had looked at him, and her face had gone completely, utterly still, not blank. There was a difference. And Daniel knew his wife well enough to know the difference. Blank was empty. What he had seen was full. So full it had nowhere left to go. And so it had simply settled like a door closing quietly on something that had been open for a very long time. He called a 3rd time. Voicemail. He sat down on the couch, her couch, the one she had selected from 4 different designers, because she wanted the penthouse to feel like a home. And he put his phone face down on the cushion beside him and made himself sit with what he had done. Amara was in a black cab heading across the city before the elevator had finished descending. She had not cried in the lobby. She had not stood on the pavement outside the building processing what she had just seen. She had walked out, raised her hand for a cab, with the calm automatic gesture of someone whose body is operating on a separate track from the part of the mind that is doing the real work. And she had gotten in and given the driver an address in Mayfair. Adwoa's address. Adwoa Mensah had been Amara's closest friend since they were 14 years old and studying together at the same school in Accra, competing fiercely for the same academic prizes and becoming inseparable in the process. She was now a corporate attorney in London, sharp and precise and completely without patience for anything she considered self-deception. She was the only person in London outside of Daniel who knew everything about Amara, including the parts that Amara kept quiet, in rooms full of people who had already decided what she was. Adwoa opened the door before Amara knocked, which meant she had seen her come through the building entrance on the camera feed. She kept on her phone for security purposes and had been watching her cross the lobby with an expression that told her everything before a word was spoken. Come in, Adwoa said. Amara came in. She sat down on Adwoa's sofa. She accepted the glass of water that appeared in her hand without asking for it. And then she sat for a moment in the particular silence of someone who is organizing something very large into the order it needs to be in before it can be spoken. He had a woman in the penthouse, she said, on my couch, in his shirt, drinking my wine. Adwoa sat down across from her. She did not gasp. She did not immediately begin producing the expressions of outrage that the situation technically warranted. She looked at Amara with the focused attention of someone who understood that her job right now was not to react but to listen. How long have you known something was wrong? Adwoa asked. 3 months, Amara said. Properly known. Suspected longer. And tonight was the confirmation. Amara looked at her hands. I set my bag down and I left. Did you say anything to him? No. Adwoa was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? And this was why Amara had come here, and not to a hotel and not to her mother, and not to anyone else, because Adwoa did not ask what happened or how she was feeling, or what Daniel had said. She asked what Amara wanted to do, because Adwoa understood, as very few people did, that Amara Osei was not a woman to whom things happened. She was a woman who made decisions, and the most useful thing anyone could do right now was give her a quiet room and the right question. Amara looked up. I want to call my grandfather, she said. Adwoa nodded once and stood and went to make tea, because some conversations require privacy, even from your closest friend, and she understood that without being told. Emmanuel Osei picked up on the second ring. He was 81 years old and he slept lightly, and he had been waiting for this call, not this specific call, not this specific night, but a call from Amara that had this particular quality of weight in her first breath, for longer than he would tell her. Amara, he said. Grandpa. And just that, just his name, in her voice saying her name, something loosened in her chest that she had been holding tightly for 8 months. She told him everything. Not in the fragmented emotional way that grief sometimes produces, but clearly and in order, the way she always told him things. Because Emmanuel had taught her that clarity was not the enemy of feeling, that you could feel something completely and still be precise about it, that precision was, in fact, a form of respect for the truth of what you had experienced. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, there was a pause. Not the pause of someone searching for the right things to say, but the pause of someone who already knows what needs to be said and is making sure the moment is right to say it. Are you safe? He asked first. Always first. Yes, she said. Are you at Adwoa's? Yes. Good. Another pause. Amara, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about the answer before you give it to me. Okay, she said. Is this the end? Or is this the moment? She sat with that question the way her grandfather had taught her to sit, with important questions, not rushing toward an answer, letting it settle, feeling where it landed. The moment, she said finally. She heard him exhale, not with relief exactly, with recognition. Then, Emmanuel O.C. said quietly, in the voice he used when he was about to say something he had been waiting the right time to say, I think it is time for certain people to learn certain things about who you are. The room was very still, and Amara, for the first time since she had walked through her front door and seen the woman on her couch, felt something that was not grief and was not anger and was not even relief. It was clarity, clean and complete and ready. What would you do if the person who underestimated you the most was about to find out exactly who you are? Would you correct them directly or let the truth speak for itself? Tell me in the comments. I genuinely want to know. Daniel did not sleep that night. He lay on his side of the bed in the penthouse that had gone completely quiet and stared at the ceiling and thought about the expression on Amara's face when she had walked through that door. He kept returning to it the way a tongue returns to a sore tooth, not because it felt good, but because some part of him understood that looking away from it would be a form of dishonesty he could no longer afford. He had been dishonest with himself for 8 months. Not about Sophia, not entirely. The situation with Sophia had developed with the particular slow momentum of things that happen when a person stops paying attention to their own choices and starts simply responding to whatever is immediately in front of them, but dishonest about something larger, about the way his father had re-entered his daily life and rearranged it, about the way he had allowed that rearrangement to happen without examining what it was costing him, about the way he had looked at Amara across their dinner table 6 months ago and seen her patience and interpreted it as contentment when he should have recognized it for what it actually was. She had been waiting, not passively, not helplessly. Amara did not do anything passively. She had been waiting with the focused stillness of someone who collects information before they act, and who understands that the moment of action means more when it is chosen rather than forced. He understood that now. He had understood it too late. He called her at 6 a.m. because he had not slept and because the silence of the penthouse had become unbearable. Voicemail. He called at 6:15. Voicemail. He put his phone down and went to the kitchen and stood at the window where she stood every morning and made coffee badly because he had never learned exactly how she made it and had simply always drunk what she made without thinking to ask. He stood at the window with bad coffee and watched the city go from purple to gray to pale yellow and thought about all the mornings she had stood in this exact spot while he was still asleep and what she had been thinking about during all those quiet early hours and how he had never once asked. His phone rang at 7:03. He reached for it so fast, he nearly knocked it off the counter. It was his father. Richard Caldwell did not call to ask about Amara. Richard Caldwell called at 7:03 in the morning to discuss the Frankfurt deal, specifically a clause in the regulatory filing that needed Daniel's sign-off by end of business. And he spoke for 4 minutes about it with the brisk, focused energy of a man for whom Tuesday morning meant work and nothing else. Daniel let him finish. Then he said, Amara left last night. There was a pause, not a long one. Left, Richard said. She came home and found Sophia there. She left. Another pause. Richard Caldwell was a man who processed information quickly and who had strong opinions about everything. But he was also a man who understood the value of choosing his words carefully. When a situation had legal or financial implications, he hadn't yet fully mapped. I see, he said finally. That's all you have? Daniel said. Daniel, this is not the time to. She's my wife, Dad. Daniel's voice came out harder than he intended. She's my wife, and she walked out of this penthouse last night, and she won't answer my calls, and you want to talk about the Frankfurt filing. Richard's tone shifted into the register Daniel recognized from boardrooms, careful and controlled, and designed to de-escalate without conceding anything. These things happen in marriages, Richard said, particularly when there's pressure. You give her time, she comes back, you have a conversation, you move forward. That's how it works. You don't know her, Daniel said. I know women in her position, Richard said, and the certainty in his voice was so complete and so utterly wrong that Daniel felt something move in his chest that was half fury and half something else. Something that had been building quietly for months and had just found its shape. What position is that? Daniel asked. His voice had gone very quiet. Richard paused, sensing something in the quiet. Daniel. What position is that, Dad? Say it clearly, a longer pause this time. She married into this family with nothing, Richard said. That creates a certain dynamic. She understands that. She'll be back. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I'll call you about Frankfurt tomorrow, and ended the call. He stood in the kitchen for a long time after. She married into this family with nothing. He thought about the night he met Amara at the conference dinner in London. He thought about the conversation that had reorganized his understanding of three problems he had been thinking about for years. He thought about the Oxford doctorate she wore so lightly that people who hadn't asked about it didn't know it existed. He thought about the quiet London office she kept, the consultancy work, the research papers she was always drafting or reviewing or refining at the kitchen island, late at night when she thought he was asleep. He thought about what she had told him 3 years ago about her grandfather's company. He had known. He had known everything about who she was when he married her. And somewhere in the past 8 months, buried under his father's influence and his own choices, and the particular arrogance of a man who stops attention because he has decided he already knows. He had let himself forget. His father had never known. And standing in that kitchen at 7:09 in the morning with cold, bad coffee and an empty penthouse, Daniel Caldwell understood something that should have alarmed him considerably sooner. His father was about to find out. Emmanuel Osi arrived in London on Wednesday morning. He had not told Amara he was coming. He had simply called her at 8 a.m. and said, I am at Heathrow. And she had gone still for a moment and then said, I'll send a car, and that had been the entire conversation, because Emmanuel Osi was not a man who announced his intentions at length when his actions would communicate them more efficiently. He was 81 years old, and he moved through Adwoa's front door with the unhurried authority of a man who had spent 6 decades making decisions that shaped markets, and who had never once needed to raise his voice to be heard. He was not tall. He was not physically imposing in the way that people imagined powerful men to be. He was slight and careful, and when he looked at you, he looked at all of you. The same quality of attention Amara had inherited from him, the kind that made people feel simultaneously seen and accountable. He sat at Adwoa's kitchen table across from Amara, and he looked at her for a long moment. You're not sleeping, he said. I'm sleeping fine, she said. He looked at her. I'm sleeping adequately, she corrected. He nodded, accepting the amendment. He accepted tea from Adwoa, who had the particular gift of making herself usefully present without intruding, and he wrapped both hands around the mug, the way Amara wrapped her hands around her morning coffee. And she understood, with a small, quiet ache, that she had inherited that too. Tell me about the marriage, he said. Not last night, the marriage. So she did. She told him about the 2 years that had been real, and the 8 months that had been erosion, and the way she had watched it happen, and stayed because she believed in giving people room, and because she had loved Daniel genuinely, and because leaving felt like giving up on something she had chosen with her whole self. Emmanuel listened. He did not interrupt. He did not offer the expressions of sympathy that the situation invited, because Emmanuel Osi understood that sympathy without strategy was just sentiment, and Amara did not need sentiment. She needed someone who would sit across from her and treat her situation with the same seriousness she brought to it herself. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The Caldwell Group, he said thoughtfully. Richard Caldwell. Yes, Amara said. Emmanuel turned his tea mug slowly in his hands. I know of him, he said. We have never met. He operates in the European market in ways that have occasionally intersected with our interests. He paused. He has always assumed he was the largest presence in the room. Amara watched her grandfather's face. He has never been in a room with me, Emmanuel said simply. The kitchen was very quiet. Adwoa, from her position near the counter, found something extremely interesting to look at in her tea. Grandpa, Amara said carefully, what are you thinking? Emmanuel Osi set down his mug. He looked at his granddaughter with the expression she had known her entire life, the one that meant he had already thought 3 moves ahead and was now simply waiting for her to catch up. I am thinking, he said, that Richard Caldwell has spent 3 years underestimating my granddaughter inside his own son's marriage. He paused. And I am thinking that the Caldwell Group has a significant portfolio overlap with 3 of our European holdings that Richard has apparently never investigated carefully enough to notice. Amara went very still. I am thinking, Emmanuel continued quietly, that a man who believes information is power should be more careful about the information he chooses not to seek. The room was completely silent. Then Amara said, what are you going to do? Emmanuel picked up his tea. Nothing dramatic, he said. I am simply going to make some calls. Introduce myself to some people. Attend a meeting or 2. He looked at her over the rim of his mug. And let certain things become visible that have been invisible for too long. He took a sip of his tea. The truth, Emmanuel Osi said, does not need to be announced. It only needs to be seen. Have you ever had someone in your corner who believed in you so completely that their confidence gave you back your own? Tell me about that person in the comments. This story is about to take a turn that nobody in the Caldwell world is prepared for, and I want you here for it. Richard Caldwell received the first call on a Thursday morning. It came from Gerald Whitmore, who was 73 years old, and had been chairman of the European Real Estate Investment Council for 11 years, and who did not call people casually. Gerald called when something required his personal attention, which happened perhaps 4 times a year, and when his name appeared on your screen, you answered immediately, and you paid attention to every word. Because Gerald Whitmore did not use extra ones, Richard answered on the first ring. Gerald, he said, with the comfortable warmth of 2 men who had known each other for 20 years and had made each other considerable amounts of money across that time. Richard, Gerald's voice was pleasant and precise. I wanted to call you personally before you heard it through other channels. Emmanuel Osi is in London. Richard paused. He knew the name. Everyone in European real estate, at a certain level, knew the name the way you know the names of weather systems and geological formations, things that shape the landscape, whether or not you have personally encountered them. Emmanuel Osi's investment group was one of those names, spoken with the particular respect reserved for entities that had been quietly accumulating influence since before most current players had entered the market. I wasn't aware he traveled to London regularly, Richard said carefully. He doesn't, Gerald said. That's rather why I'm calling. A pause. He reached out to me yesterday, asked for an introduction to several of our council members. Very specific ones, Richard. The ones with the largest positions in the Northern European commercial corridor. Richard's hand tightened slightly on his phone. The Northern European commercial corridor was where the Caldwell Group had spent the last 2 years consolidating its most significant holdings. It was the centerpiece of their expansion strategy. It was the thing Richard had been building toward for a decade. Did he say why? Richard asked. His voice was perfectly even. He mentioned he was reviewing some portfolio overlaps, Gerald said, and that he wanted to establish direct relationships before making certain decisions. Another pause, longer this time. He also mentioned, and I thought this was rather interesting, that he had personal reasons for wanting to understand the London market more closely at this particular moment. Personal reasons. Richard sat down. Thank you for calling, Gerald, he said. Of course, Gerald said. I thought you'd want to know. And then, almost as an afterthought, so smooth it might have been accidental. How is your son, Richard? And his wife? Lovely woman. I met her briefly at the Meridian dinner last spring. Extraordinarily sharp. She said something about land rights in West Africa that I've been thinking about ever since. The call ended 2 minutes later. Richard sat in his office on the 14th floor of the Caldwell Group headquarters and looked at the wall in front of him and thought about what Gerald had just said and what he had not said and what the combination of the 2 things meant. He thought about Amara. He thought about 3 years of assumptions he had never examined. He thought about a wire transfer returned within 48 hours with a polite note. He picked up his phone and called his head of research, a meticulous woman named Caroline, who could find detailed background information on any individual or entity within 4 hours if she considered the matter urgent. I need everything you can find on the Osi Group, Richard said, and on Emmanuel O.C. personally, and on his granddaughter. He paused. Her name is Amara. She goes by Amara Caldwell now, but her birth name is Amara O.C. There was a brief silence on the line. Amara O.C., Caroline repeated carefully. As in, find out, Richard said. Everything. Today. Daniel had been calling Amara for 3 days without an answer when her attorney called his attorney. The attorney's name was Nana Asana, and she was based in both London and Accra, and had represented the O.C. family's legal interests for 15 years, which was information that Daniel's attorney conveyed to Daniel with the particular tone of someone delivering news they find significant and want to make sure the recipient is properly receiving. The communication was formal and precise. It outlined Amara's intention to begin divorce proceedings. It referenced the marital property agreement they had signed before the wedding, the one Richard had dismissed as unnecessary at the time because he assumed there was nothing on Amara's side worth protecting. It noted that Amara would be retaining independent legal counsel for all proceedings, and that all future communication should go through the respective attorneys. It was 3 paragraphs long, and it was the most efficiently devastating document Daniel had read in his professional life, which was considerable, because Daniel Caldwell had read a great many devastating documents in the course of running a multi-billion-dollar operation. He read it twice. Then he did something he had not done in 8 months. He drove to his father's office unannounced. Richard was on a call when Daniel walked in. His assistant said something behind him that Daniel did not hear because he was already through the door. And Richard looked up from his desk with the expression he used when people did things that violate protocol, sharp and controlled, and held up one finger to indicate Daniel should wait. Daniel sat down across from his father's desk and waited. Richard ended the call 90 seconds later. Caroline finished her report, Richard said before Daniel could speak. His voice had a quality Daniel had never heard in it before. Not uncertainty exactly. Something adjacent to it. Something that sounded like a man recalibrating at speed. I know, Daniel said. Richard looked at him. You knew, Richard said slowly. When you married her, you knew who she was. Yes, Daniel said. You knew about the O.C. group, about Emmanuel, about the portfolio. She told me the night we met, Daniel said, straightforwardly, because I asked her real questions and she answered them honestly. He paused. That's who she is, Dad. That's what she does. She tells the truth and she does the work, and she doesn't perform for anyone. He looked at his father directly. And you spent 3 years treating her like she was temporary. Richard said nothing. Caroline's report, Daniel continued. What did it say? About the portfolio overlap? Richard was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the O.C. group holds significant positions in 4 of the corridors where we've been consolidating, not competing positions, adjacent ones. In 2 cases, their holdings are structured in ways that give them effective influence over the regulatory environment our expansion depends on. Daniel let that sit. She never used it, Richard said, and there was something in his voice now that was almost impossible to name. Something between disbelief and something that might, given enough time, become respect. 3 years. She had that leverage and she never used it. She didn't marry Daniel Caldwell to use leverage, Daniel said quietly. She married me because she thought I saw her. He stopped and I did, for a while. And then I stopped paying attention, and I let you back into the middle of my marriage. And I made choices I cannot undo. He looked at his father. But this part, what you did, treating her like she was nothing, like she should be grateful, sending that wire transfer like she could be managed, that part is yours. The office was very quiet. Richard Caldwell, who had not been silenced by another person in a professional context in longer than he could remember, sat behind his desk and said nothing. Emmanuel O.C. is in London, Daniel said. He came for his granddaughter. Not for the portfolio, not for the business, for her. He stood. I want you to meet him. I'm going to ask if he'll agree to it. And when you sit across from that man, I want you to understand that every assumption you made about Amara was wrong, every single one, and that the cost of those assumptions is something our family is going to be living with for a long time. He walked to the door. Daniel, Richard said. Daniel stopped but didn't turn. I was wrong about her, Richard said. The words came out with the effortful precision of a man who finds admission genuinely difficult and is doing it anyway. I understand that now. Daniel turned around. Tell her, he said. Not me. Emmanuel O.C. agreed to the meeting. Not because Richard deserved it, and not because the business interests required it, though they did, increasingly, as Caroline's report had made clear. Emmanuel agreed because Amara asked him to, and because Emmanuel Osi had spent 81 years believing that the truth should be witnessed rather than simply known, that the people who had operated on wrong assumptions should be required to sit across from the reality they had refused to see and look at it directly. The meeting took place in a private dining room at a hotel in Mayfair on a Friday afternoon. Emmanuel arrived first. He was already seated when Richard walked in, and the first thing Richard noticed was that the man across the table did not stand to greet him. Not out of rudeness, but with the settled ease of someone who has nothing to prove, and therefore no performance to give. Richard sat down. Emmanuel looked at him with the complete unhurried attention that Amara had inherited from him. "Mr. Caldwell," Emmanuel said. "Mr. Osi," Richard said. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "I agreed for my granddaughter's sake," Emmanuel said simply. "Not for yours. I want to be honest about that from the beginning, so that we do not waste each other's time with pleasantries that neither of us means." Richard absorbed that. "Understood," he said. "Good." Emmanuel folded his hands on the table. "Then let me tell you about Amara. Not about her portfolio, not about her inheritance, not about what her last name represents commercially. Let me tell you about who she is." He paused. "Because you have been in proximity to one of the most remarkable people I have ever known for 3 years, and you looked at her and saw nothing, and I find that I cannot sit across from you without addressing that directly." Richard said nothing, and Emmanuel Osei, who had spent 60 years building an empire with the same quiet thoroughness his granddaughter had inherited, told Richard Caldwell about Amara. He told him about the girl who had sat at his kitchen table at 14, working through economic theory with the focused joy of someone who had found the thing they were born to do. He told him about the 18-year-old who had managed his London correspondence with more precision than assistants twice her age, while simultaneously preparing her university applications. He told him about the 22-year-old who had sat beside her mother's hospital bed every night for 7 months and still submitted her doctoral thesis on time because she had decided that her mother would want her to. That finishing was a form of love. He told him about the woman who had returned a wire transfer because she understood immediately what it meant and had more self-respect than to accept being managed. He told him about the research paper on colonial land rights that 3 separate academic journals had already requested the right to publish. He told him about the consultancy that had quietly advised 4 West African governments on infrastructure investment strategy in the past 2 years, while Amara was living inside Richard's idea of who she was. Richard Caldwell sat across from Emmanuel's Osi and listened, and with each thing Emmanuel said, something shifted in Richard's face. Not dramatically, not with the visible collapse of a man having a sudden revelation, but with the slow, irreversible quality of a person understanding something that cannot be understood. Once it cannot be unknown. When Emmanuel finished, the room was very quiet. "She loved my son," Richard said finally. "It was not a question." "Completely," Emmanuel said, "and freely, without calculation, which is rarer than you would think among people who have as many options as Amara has always had." Richard looked at the table. "I would like to apologize to her," he said, "if she will allow it." Emmanuel looked at him for a long moment. "That," he said, "is not my permission to give." Amara was at Edwo's kitchen table working on her research paper when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Richard Caldwell. She looked at it for 2 full rings. Then she answered. "Amara," Richard said. His voice had none of its usual architecture, none of the careful structure of a powerful man managing a conversation. It sounded like someone who had put down something heavy and was still feeling the absence of the weight. "I would like to speak with you. Not about the divorce proceedings, not about the business. I would like to speak with you, as the woman my son chose, and as someone I should have seen clearly from the beginning, and didn't." A pause. "I understand if you say no. I want you to know that I will understand completely." Amara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the research paper spread across Edwoa's kitchen table. She thought about 3 years of dinners where Richard had spoken around her. She thought about the wire transfer. She thought about every small, precise dismissal, laid end to end across 3 years of family occasions. She thought about what her grandfather had said. The truth does not need to be announced. It only needs to be seen. Richard had seen it. "Tuesday," she said, 11 o'clock. "You come to me." "Yes," Richard said immediately. "Of course, thank you." She ended the call. Edwoa appeared in the kitchen doorway with the expression of someone who has been trying very hard not to listen and has largely failed. "Well," she said. Amara picked up her pen. "Tuesday," she said, and went back to her paper. Daniel came to Edwoa's building on a Sunday evening. He did not call ahead because he understood she would not answer. And he did not send a message through the attorneys, because what he needed to say was not a legal matter. He stood outside the building, and he called her number, and when it went to voicemail, he said simply, "I'm outside. I'm not asking to come up. I just need 5 minutes. Please." He waited on the pavement for 11 minutes. Then the building door opened, and Amara came out. She was wearing a coat he recognized, dark green, the one she wore on weekend mornings when she went to the market, and she stood on the pavement in front of him with her hands in her pockets and looked at him with those quiet, full eyes and waited. He had rehearsed this. He had sat in the Silver Lake apartment that didn't exist yet, in the penthouse that felt like an echo chamber, in his car outside this building for 11 minutes. And he had rehearsed what he needed to say, and all of it had evaporated the moment he saw her face. So he said the true thing instead. "I knew who you were when I married you," he said. "I knew exactly who you were. And somewhere in the past 8 months, I let myself forget, or I let myself be convinced to forget, and I made choices that I cannot justify and cannot undo." He stopped. "I am not here to ask you to reconsider. I understand what you've decided, and I understand why, and I am not going to stand here and tell you that you're wrong." He looked at her directly. "I just needed you to hear me say that I know what I had. I know what I threw away. Not the portfolio, not the name, not the inheritance. You. I know what I threw away." Amara looked at him for a long moment. The street was quiet around them. A light rain had started, very fine, barely there. The kind that doesn't feel like rain until you've been standing in it for a while. "I know you know," she said, and her voice was not cold and not warm, but something honest and final, the temperature of a thing that has settled into its true form. "That's the hardest part, Daniel. You always did know. You just stopped choosing it." He nodded, because there was nothing to say to that except yes. "Take care of yourself," she said. "You too," he said. She went back inside. He stood on the pavement in the fine rain for a moment. Then he walked to his car. And that was the last conversation they had that was not conducted through attorneys. Richard Caldwell came on Tuesday at 11 o'clock precisely. He came alone. No assistant, no attorney, no buffer of any kind. He sat across from Amara in Adwoa's sitting room, which was not a power setting, which was exactly why she had chosen it. And he looked at her with the expression of a man who has recently learned something that has rearranged his understanding of a significant period of his own life. He spoke for 6 minutes. He did not make excuses. He did not contextualize or qualify or soften. He said what he had done, specifically, and he said it was wrong, specifically, and he said he was sorry in the way that people are sorry when they mean it, rather than when they are performing contrition for strategic purposes. Amara listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," she said. "I want you to know that I don't carry anger about it. I carried disappointment for a long time, but I've set that down." She looked at him steadily. "What I want you to understand, and what I want you to carry with you, is that the assumptions you made about me were not just wrong about me. They were wrong about people, about what a person's value consists of and where it comes from, and what it means to actually see someone." She paused. "Your son learned that too late. I hope you learn it in time to do something with it." Richard said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I think I am beginning to." Amara nodded once. "Good," she said, and that was enough. This story shows us something profound, that the people who underestimate us quietly are often building something those people cannot yet imagine. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who later had to completely rethink their assumptions? Tell me what happened in the comments. Every single story matters. 6 months later, the OC Group announced a strategic partnership with 3 of the largest infrastructure investment councils in Northern Europe. The announcement was made quietly, as Emmanuel Osai preferred to make all significant announcements through a single press release issued on a Tuesday morning that was precise and brief and contained no unnecessary words. Financial analysts spent the better part of that week unpacking its implications. And the consensus that emerged was that the partnership represented one of the most significant realignments of commercial real estate influence in the European market over a decade. The Caldwell Group was not mentioned in the announcement. Richard Caldwell read it at his desk on Tuesday morning and sat with it for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called his son. Daniel had moved out of the penthouse 2 months after Amara left. He had taken very little. Some clothes, his books, the photograph from their first trip together to Lisbon, that he had no right to take and took anyway, because he could not make himself leave it behind. He had moved into a smaller apartment in Clerkenwell that had nothing in it that reminded him of the life he had built, and dismantled. And he had spent the first month in it doing what he should have done 8 months earlier. He had sat with himself honestly and examined the choices he had made and the person he had been becoming under his father's influence. And the distance between that person and the man Amara had agreed to build a life with. He had started therapy in month 2, not because anyone told him to, because he understood, with the particular clarity that arrives after significant loss, that the patterns that had produced his choices did not belong only to the 8 months in question. They went deeper and further back and required more than good intentions to address. He worked. He restructured his involvement in the Caldwell Group, pulling back from the day-to-day operations his father had drawn him into and returning to the division he had built himself, the sustainable development arm that had been his original contribution to the company and that had been quietly thriving while he was distracted. He did not contact Amara. He understood that the most respectful thing he could do for her now was to become someone worth respecting, not for her sake. She had moved entirely beyond needing anything from him, but for his own. Because a man who does not do the work of becoming better simply becomes a cautionary tale, and Daniel Caldwell, at 38, was not ready to be only that. Amara's research paper was published in the Journal of Economic History on a Friday in April. It was 43 pages long, and it was precise and original. And 3 weeks after publication, it had been cited by 2 government bodies and downloaded over 12,000 times, which for an academic paper in that field was extraordinary. She was in Accra when it published, sitting at her grandfather's kitchen table, where she had sat as a 14-year-old working through economic theory with the focused joy of someone who had found the thing they were born to do. Emmanuel made tea. The morning light came through the kitchen window, the way it always had, warm and unhurried, and they sat together in the comfortable silence of 2 people who love each other and have nothing left to prove to anyone. "How does it feel?" Emmanuel asked. Amara wrapped both hands around her mug. "Like a beginning," she said. He smiled. The particular smile she had known her entire life, the one that meant he had known it, would feel exactly like this, and had been waiting for her to arrive at the feeling herself. "Good," he said. "Because it is." She returned to London the following week and walked into the offices of the consultancy her grandfather had insisted on funding, the quiet space in Mayfair that she had maintained through 3 years of marriage and invisible work and patient waiting. She sat at her desk. She opened her laptop. She looked at the 3 project proposals waiting for her response. 2 from government bodies. 1 from an international development organization that had read her paper and wanted to discuss its implications for their investment strategy. She opened the first one. She began, not looking back, not waiting for anyone's permission, not making herself small for any room she walked into ever again. Amara Osei, whose name had been underestimated in 1,000 quiet ways by people who had never bothered to look closely enough to see it, sat at her own desk in her own space, doing her own work. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything. Adwoa called that evening. "The paper is everywhere," she said, and her voice had the particular quality it got when she was proud of someone and trying not to make it into a production. 3 people sent it to me today. 3 separate people who have no idea I know you." "I know," Amara said. "Are you pleased?" Amara looked out the window at the London evening, the city going amber and gray in the early dusk, familiar and entirely hers. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." Stories like this one remind us of something we sometimes forget in the noise of ordinary life, that the quietest people in the room are often carrying the largest things. That patience is not the same as weakness, that the moment a person decides to stop waiting and start building is the most powerful moment in any story. Amara did not win because she was wealthy. She did not win because her grandfather had influence, or because the portfolio numbers lined up in her favor. She won because she knew who she was when everyone around her had decided who she wasn't. And she never, not for a single morning, stopped being that person. That is the kind of victory that no one can take from you. If this story moved you, if something in Amara's quiet strength spoke to something in your own life, please like this video. It takes 1 second, and it helps this story reach someone who might need it today. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one. Stories about people who were underestimated and who built something extraordinary anyway. And I want to leave you with one question to carry into your week. Where in your life have you been making yourself smaller than you are? And what would change if you stopped? Think about it. Sit with it the way Amara sat with the hard questions, patiently and with complete attention. And then begin. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. It means more than you know. Now go build something worth building.